and yet he frustrates me at times because, like when you're reading Paul, sometimes he gets carried away and he'll repeat things over and over and over again, and he turns what could have been like a 2-chapter letter into a 16-chapter letter. On the same note, we do have a man who is very passionate about what he believed and was willing to go to the nth degree to carry his beliefs to those that he was building relationships with and building communities out of. And in some of his finest moments, he could really articulate what something was in a way that not only made it real for you and made it personal, but made it applicable and practical as well. And I think here is one of those instances where Paul gives us kind of the formula of faith: endurance, character, hope, faith. Now, when we look around our world, we see all of the things, the crazy things that happen in it. And quite frankly, it's quite easy to get caught up in fear. Look at 9/11. Right after 9/11, we didn't know what was left, right, up, down. We didn't know what the future held. All we knew is we were attacked. And what did we do? And I'm not putting a judgment on what we did, but we reacted to that event and attacked back, which is the way of history. Someone attacks you, you attack them back, they attack back, you attack back, but it's always a reaction based off of something else. And our country as a whole, not just militarily, because I mean, what else are you going to do from a military perspective? If someone attacks you, you need to attack back from a military perspective. But the nation as a whole, beyond that, reacted in fear. I remember shortly after the attacks, there were people in the streets who were being beat up because they looked like they were Muslim. Some of them were Sikhs who are not Muslim at all, and Indians. But anybody who generally looked like somebody that fit that profile got attacked. And I remember President Bush coming on very quickly afterwards, coming on the airs and saying, look it, we cannot be attacking our own fellow citizens. These were a specific group of people that attacked us, but we are not at war with Islam or with Muslims or with people who look differently than us, and we cannot react in fear. But it's easy to, when something that jarring hits you, and you don't know what else to do, and you're afraid for your life and the lives of your friends and your family, it's very easy to get caught up in fear. And we see politicians getting mired. When we look in the news, we see politicians getting mired in all sorts of scandals. We see children getting killed in Newtown, Connecticut, and other places. We see terrorist attacks. We see people struggling, not to mention the body count in the aftermath of natural disasters. We see famine and disease. There are a lot of things in our lives that inundate us and cause us to be afraid. One of the things in the aftermath of the tornado, and I meant to pray for them earlier, but we'll certainly keep them in our prayers. Those people, are living their lives every day, and what do we hear from people? And I hear from people living in New Jersey. Well, what are they living out there for? They know it's a tornado alley. I mean, it's nicknamed the Tornado Alley. Why are they still living there? And the same response was given to in regard to people who lived in New Orleans. Well, who would live in something that's in a place that's below sea level? It's bound to get, it's like a big spaghetti bowl, It's like it's bound to get filled up with water. And I heard people saying this in New Jersey. I guess people could ask us why we're still living here after Hurricane Sandy. The fact of the matter is, we react to fear, and we react to our emotions. And we say and do things often that perhaps aren't the best things to do, but seem like the only thing we can do because of our fear. There is a lot to fear in our own personal lives as well. From our health, to our finances, to our relationships, we are inundated by fear. And we live in a culture that lives and breathes fear. All we have to do is turn on the news and listen to the fear that gets tumbled around the 24-hour cable news cycle. Yet, we are not called to live in fear. Rather, we are called to live in faith. In our text today, Paul writes that we have been justified by what? By fear? My fellow Christians, you are justified in your fear. No. We are justified by our faith. We are justified by our faith, not by our fear. And it is through faith that we have access to the grace in which we stand. Notice that fear is not a part of the blueprint of faith. That is not to say that the faithful will not experience fear. We were just talking in class earlier about how Satan has come into our theology from the Old Testament through the New Testament, and then today we were talking about some of the early church fathers and the persecutions in which they were suffering under. And it would be delusional at best, if not a lie, to say that they were not afraid. And I think in some of the ways the texts get written down, especially Revelation and the letters of John and some of those texts, it would be safe to say that some of their reaction was in fear. So it would be wrong to say that we as Christians who are faithful are not going to experience fear. Nowhere in the Bible does it say you shall not experience fear. Nowhere does Paul say you will not experience fear. Faith does not cause fear to go away. But faith helps one to transcend their fear, to rise above it, to act out of love in spite of it. And we all go through tough times that cause us to suffer, that cause us to fear. And we often fear pain and suffering. Think of all the things we do in our culture to avoid pain and suffering, for fear of pain and suffering. Comedian Dennis Leary, which most of his jokes I could not repeat in church, or at least without seriously editing them. But he has a point when he was talking about people and their fear of smoke and smoking and how smoking is bad. And he was saying at some point they're going to ban smoking altogether, and they're going to be like, "Come out, we know you're in there. Come out with your hands up over your head," And he said, people tell you, like, "Do you realize that smoking is bad for you?" Really? I didn't know that, right? But he says, people worry so much about their health, and yet they still die too. People running down the road, and I'm a health nut, so I can say this, right? People running down the road, and he talks about this one guy, Jimmy Fix, I guess, who was running down the road. He was a runaholic, and he died doing what? Running. Of what? A heart attack. Go figure. The fact of the matter is, not that we shouldn't run, I do, and not that we shouldn't try to be healthy, I try. Not that we shouldn't smoke, because we shouldn't. I said that wrong. Yeah, we shouldn't smoke. But the fact of the matter is, our fear drives us. But it doesn't stop these other things from happening. But we often fear our pain and suffering. But how do we respond to that fear? Do we succumb to it? Or do we step in faith beyond it? How many of you have seen the entire Star Wars series, not just the original ones, but like Star Wars Episode 1, 2, 3. Good peeps, good peeps. Excellent. In Star Wars Episode 1, Anakin Skywalker, who grows up to be none other than Darth Vader, Anakin Skywalker is a young, cute little boy, grew up in slavery. His mom, gives him to the Jedi Knights so he can have a better life. And the Jedis buy him from the slave. But this boy has grown up in fear and has a lot of fear. And he's brought before the Council of the Jedis to see if he could be the one who will fulfill the prophecy and restore the Empire. Not the Empire, excuse me. Restore the Republic. This is before it becomes the Empire. And he's standing there and Yoda goes, He says, I sense fear. Right? And Anakin goes, what of it? What difference does fear make? And Yoda replies that it does make difference. Fear leads to hate, hate to pain, pain to suffering. Right? Right? That's what Yoda says. No, I will never do that again. Fear leads to hate. Hate leads to pain. Pain leads to suffering. It's kind of funny how much of a self-perpetuating cycle that is. We fear, we hate, we are in pain, and we suffer. And yet our fear derives from our suffering. God does not want us to live in fear. God wants us to live in faith, to step beyond our fears and trust that God will get us through all that the world has to throw our way. True wisdom, according to the author of Proverbs, looks around at creation and rejoices. She calls out to all of us, beckoning us to see that God is with us, that God created us, that God is in control. On a side note, I love that wisdom is shown as a female in Proverbs. The same wisdom that gets interpreted later on to be logos. Right? In the beginning was the Word, logos. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and everything was created through the Word. Which, by the way, in Greek is the same thing as that divine creative force, the divine wisdom. God is in control. We often fear what we can't control. But I have either a very scary or a very liberating revelation for you. You can't control anything. Anything. Control is an illusion. The more you try to control, the less control you'll realize you actually have. You think you can control your car, but you can't control the car coming towards you. You think you can control being to work on time, but you can't control the traffic that stops you. You think you can control being safe, but you can't control the events that fall down around you. People could move out of Tornado Alley and go live somewhere else, but that's not going to stop a natural disaster from hitting them there. We can't truly control anything. Paul teaches us rather than fearing what we can't control, rather than fearing what we cannot control, rather than living in fear, we need to live in faith and see things through our faith as opposed to our fear. Our faith calls us to look back at our lives and see how God has pulled us through our suffering, through our fears. Each and every one of us can look back to any series of events in our lives and see, whoa, I'm still here. Our faith calls us to look back at our lives and see how God has pulled us through our suffering, through our fears. Even in the midst of suffering right now, we can take a deep breath and notice we're still here. There's still something to live for. There's still somebody holding me up, just as has been done in the past. My faith journey is an interesting one. I grew up in the church. I had great faith as a child. I felt called at the age of 8 or 10, really probably the age of 3, but in my cognitive memory, 8 or 10. I knew I was called to be a pastor. But I went through difficult times as a teenager, as many teenagers do. And by the end of my teenage years, I was confused as to what I believed, if I believed anything. I left the church. I couldn't trust the church because, I'd walk in on a Sunday with tattoos and get looks like I was going to hell. And I couldn't understand it. And so I walked away from the church. And I went through a period of years where I tried other religions, did other things, went my own way, didn't answer my call, didn't even acknowledge my call. And then around 2004, as much as I thought I was in control of my own life, I lost the very job that I had worked so hard to get as a computer programmer. Very proud of myself, traveling like my uncle does all over the country to conventions and doing different things. Really in an innovative industry. And there I was without a job, less than about a year's experience, which any job when you're looking for one wants at least 5 years experience, so if you've got a year, it doesn't count. And I couldn't find a job and had nowhere to turn and thought I was at wit's end, but who was there? God. Through my wife and through other people to remind me of my calling, and here I stand today. Now in that time, I was very afraid, and I was suffering. But here I stand today. Endurance builds character, Paul says. From suffering, Paul says, comes endurance. Our faith calls us to see that we have, thus far, endured by the grace of God. Endurance builds character. We are who we are because of the things we've gone through. Robert Schuller puts it this way. God turns our scars into stars. The things that I went through as a teenager later came to serve me as a youth pastor. The things I went through in my life are serving me now in my ministry. God does not cause or allow bad things to happen to us, but God certainly can turn those bad things into good things. Endurance builds character. Character, Paul says, builds hope. Because of our experience of God's grace, because we have seen God's work in our lives, because we have the hope that God is always with us, character builds hope. That God completes us despite our hardships and brings us healing and wholeness. Endurance, character, and hope are in the blueprint of faith. The more we endure, the more character we have, the more hope we have to hold on to, the stronger our faith becomes. So the next time fear creeps up into you, don't deny it. Don't suppress it, feel ashamed of it. Rise up above that fear and allow your faith to guide you to be God's presence of hope, God's presence of healing, and God's presence of wholeness in the lives of others. Let us pray.